Well, if not, I've had a marvelous time. It's been one of the better days lately. Let me tell y'all what I think I'm here for. And if it's not what you think I'm here for, I'm in trouble and some distance from home. And that is to work on some work I have been doing the past few years, one of which is getting my collar unbuttoned. To work on some work that I've been doing the past few years, the fundamental thesis of which is that the basic problem of contemporary organizations, broadly defined to include families and churches and businesses and governments and academic institutions, is the inability to cope with the fact that we agree with one another, and not the inability to cope with the fact we are in conflict. In fact, that most conflict of all kinds in organizations is phony and is unconsciously designed to release us from the responsibility of doing anything significant. So what I would like to do today is work with you on managing agreement in organizations, or how to cope with the Abilene paradox. As you will find, it is a very personal statement, subject to my own bizarre peculiarities and biases and odd ways of seeing the world. And because it is a personal statement, and also since I found the Abilene paradox is not exactly a household word, I think y'all are going to need to know a little bit more about me than George told you in the introduction, about how I got here, about where I came from, about my family, and particularly about how we spend our vacations. Now, I have suggested to George that I show home movies at this time. He has suggested that I not show home movies at this time. So as a way of kind of getting into the paradox, I'd like to start by telling y'all something about life with the Harveys. And just start by saying, as the map on the board might indicate, I am a native son of the great sovereign state of Texas. My home is Austin. That means hook 'em horns. Down there in Italy, it means something entirely different. I found that out when I went to University of Texas football game with an Italian friend of mine, and 70,000 people gave that from the kickoff, and he thought he was in the largest collection of perverts he'd ever seen, and in some ways may have been accurate. My wife's from a little town called Coleman, which is 53 miles southeast of Abilene on Route 84. Let me just see how much work I'm going to have to do and count the house. How many of y'all have been to Abilene? Just curious. Oh, a fair number. How many have been to Coleman? When were you in Coleman? Yeah. So, what were you doing there? I knew you looked a little more moral than the rest. And when were you in Coleman? 60s? Is that, well then, but anyone else been to Coleman? Well, then with the exception of you two, it's a very provincial group. My wife's from a little town called Coleman, which is 53 miles southeast of Abilene on Route 84. Did anyone see the movie The Last Picture Show? How many saw that? If you saw that movie, you saw Coleman. In fact, my father-in-law ran the pool hall and domino parlor at Bangs, Texas. It's 12 miles outside of Coleman. He had to run it in Bangs, and it's a carbon copy of the one in The Last Picture Show, right down to the last paint fleck. He had to run it in Bangs because Coleman is a Southern Baptist town. There is no drinking, smoking, card playing, mixed bathing, fornication, or pool shooting, at least legally. And he ran it in Bangs to get away from the Baptists. If you saw The Last Picture Show, you saw his pool hall right down to the last paint fleck, as I said. If you remember, Ben Johnson played the protagonist role in that movie. And if you listen, shut your eyes and listen to Ben Johnson talk, you heard my father-in-law talk, and he played the same role in the town. You remember the football coach in the movie had a little tin roof White House on stilts and a tin roof garage on the left side. Move it to the right side. and you saw the house my mother-in-law still lives in. My wife and I went to see that movie down at the M Street Theater in Washington about 6 months after her dad died. And we didn't know what we were getting into, and suddenly there was our town, her dad, his pool hall, and our whole life flashed before us. We left the movie in a spring rain, walked up through DuPont Circle so choked up and just started bawling. By that I meant crying. And it was an hour before either of us could talk. Well, anyway, as the vote might indicate, Coleman is not exactly the mainstream of the culture. It has 5,609 people. The Coleman Philharmonic Orchestra consists of Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys and the National Guard Armory on Saturday night, starting with I Didn't Know God Made Honky Tonk Angels, and then working slowly up to a roaring climax. The major social event in Coleman is not the presidential dinners as it is here in Washington, but it's the Coleman County Rodeo, during which time there is a rule that anyone that rides a horse into the rodeo grounds gets in free, and during rodeo time there'll be 5,609 people and 6,200 horses in town. And to make a bad but absolutely accurate pun, Coleman takes on an atmosphere of its own. A number of years ago, shortly after Beth and I were married, every summer we would make a 9-9 theory-wide, joint, participative, problem-solving, collaborative, loving decision to spend 2 glorious weeks of our summer vacation with her mama and papa in downtown Coleman. And I guess it was about in 62 or 63, we went to Coleman in the middle of July during a West Texas drought. Anyone been in West Texas during drought time? Anyone? Well, a fair number. Let me just, if you haven't, it's the middle of July, it's 106 degrees by the Walgreens X-Lax temperature gauge in the back. It hadn't rained for 35 days, and under those conditions the wind just picks up the prairie and blows it into Mexico. People take masking tape, I don't see any around here, mask around the windows to keep the dust out, stick wet towels under the door, and dust still just blows through and accumulates on everything. You drive with your lights on in broad daylight just like it's a dense fog, and people do the best they can to make do. Well, anyway, it's 106 degrees in the shade. It's a Sunday afternoon, and we are having what for Coleman is a rip-roaring afternoon of Sunday entertainment, which consists of playing dominoes and sipping lemonade. Coleman is dry in more than one way. You can get alcoholic beverages for medicinal purposes on a doctor's prescription, and to look at people's medicine cabinet, a plague is impending, but we couldn't work up an illness. And do any of y'all play dominoes? Anyone? Well, as you know, it's not a terribly debilitating game. Someone says shuffle 'em, somebody says mark me, somebody says your game, someone says let's play 42, someone says pass the lemonade. Having a hell of a time. Also sitting in front of a swamp cooler. Do y'all know what a swamp cooler is? Well, for those that don't, in that part of the country, the humidity is so low and the temperature is so high, you don't need an air conditioning unit with a coil and a compressor. You just take a big box, line it with hay, put copper tubing around the top end of the hay, drill holes in the copper tubing, then pump water through that tubing. It lets water dribble down through the hay and wet the hay, and then you blow air through that wet hay at a very high level, and that blows mud out across the room. Anyway, we're sitting in front of the swamp cooler playing dominoes, and all of a sudden my father-in-law, his name's Lehman, playing partners with me, looks up and says, "Hey y'all, let's go to Abilene and eat at the cafeteria." Well, I don't know if you've ever been in heat like that, but your mind just doesn't leap into gear. So I start turning his proposal over in my mind, and it goes something like this. God almighty. Go to Abilene and eat at the cafeteria. It's 53 miles to Abilene. It's 106 degrees in the shade. We got a 1958 unair-conditioned Buick with no shock absorbers. And if any of y'all ever hit Route 84 out towards Abilene, it's just a series of chug holes with a little asphalt around them for aesthetic purposes. And the Abilene cafeteria is very reminiscent of the enlisted man's field mess at Fort Bliss. And so as I'm turning my proposal and my reply over in my mind, suddenly my wife Beth, who's playing on my right, looks up and says, "Sounds like a great idea, but I don't want to go unless you want to go, Jerry." Well, I've been through that one before. And I suddenly hear my voice saying, "Joy unbounded, I've just been sitting here hoping someone would invite me to go to Abilene and eat at the cafeteria, but I don't want to go unless your mama wants to go." And Mama's over there in her calico dress with her stockings rolled down around her ankles, grinning like the cat that ate the canary, and she says, "Of course I want to go. You don't think I want to eat leftovers from the icebox, do you?" So we all go pile into the furnace and start for Abilene. We take a rest stop at the pool hall at Bangs, because by then you don't know whether your kidneys are located between your hip bones or your shoulder blades. We blaze into the Abilene cafeteria, have literally the worst meal known to mankind. Some 4 hours later, with lights still ablaze in broad daylight, we wheel back across the prairie through a driving dust storm and into the football coach's little tin-roof garage. By then, I don't know if you've ever been where you can just take your fingers and scrape streaks down your arm where the dust and perspiration cements everything together. And everybody piles out and goes down and sits in front of the mud machine. And by actual count, for some 45 minutes, no one said a single solitary word. There was absolute teetotal silence. Well, having been trained 4 years as a clinical psychologist, 3 years as a social psychologist, having a PhD in general psychology, 2 years of consulting experience as an organization development consultant, and having written a half-dozen articles for professional journals in group dynamics, I began to feel something was amiss. And so I came forth with what y'all in this class may have heard of. It's called a behavioral science intervention. And I said, it was a great trip, wasn't it? And my father-in-law looked up, and he only said one word. And interestingly enough to me, I never heard him say the word before in his life, and until we laid him under, I never heard him repeat it. Everybody in here will have heard the word, but with the exception of you two in the left balcony, no one will have heard it said quite as he said it. And that is, I said, it was a great trip, wasn't it? And he looks up and says, "She." Again, drawing on the wellspring of knowledge that only a PhD will provide one, I said, "What did you mean by that?" And his reply was kind of classic, and it was, "Well, hell, I never wanted to go to Abilene to begin with. I was just making conversation, and you idiots took me up on it. You've ruined my day." And I said, "What do you mean, we idiots? I didn't want to go to Abilene. I went because the three of you pressured me into it. My wife said you had to be insane to invite me out in a dust storm to eat at the Abilene cafeteria, and her mama began to cry." And from about 7:30 in the evening till 1:30 in the morning, we engaged in what is still called the Wilder family fight, where we argued as to who got us to Abilene when no one wanted to go to begin with. And when things got back on speaking terms, and we were able to talk with some clarity, I formulated what's called the Abilene paradox, which is as follows: that organizations frequently take actions contrary to the desires of any of their members and defeat the very purposes those organizations are designed to achieve. That organizations frequently take actions contrary to the desires of any of their members and defeat the very purposes they're designed to achieve. And a corollary to that is that the inability to cope with agreement and not the inability to cope with conflict is central to organization dysfunction, because we all agreed that day on what we wanted to do and turned around and did just the opposite. So between now and 11:30, what I'd like to do with y'all is work with you on the Abilene paradox. And I'd like to describe some other trips that I'm familiar with, to talk about what causes that kind of insanity, because it is indeed insanity. Then I've wired together a questionnaire, and it takes about 10 minutes to fill out. I'd like to pass it out and let y'all just ask you to briefly, in 1 or 2 words, describe a potential trip you may be on, answer 10 true-false questions about it, and then in 1-sentence segments say what, if anything, you'd like to do about it, and then we'll take a little break. And then I'm not going to ask you to discuss the answers to those things, incidentally, because some people like to put on things that are quite personal. I'll be glad to talk with you afterward about them, or even in here if you want to. Then we'll take a break and come back, and I'd like to tell you in general what those answers mean, to describe some implications of those answers, a couple of skills for getting out of Abilene if you find yourself there and want to leave, and then it should be about 11:30, and I shall ride into the sunset, hopefully paid. Are there any questions? Incidentally, as we roll along, I know this is a big group, but it may appear that I'm on a track that I got to follow. I don't have to follow it in any particular way. So as we roll along, if y'all got questions or comments or things you want to say or talk about, just stop me and I'll show you where you're wrong. Any questions? Okay, well, what I'd like, could we get another slide up there? God, isn't that magical? Oh, Lordy. What I'd like to do is to talk with you about the Abilene paradox in the bedroom, boardroom, oval room, and airport. Not because that's the only place it occurs, but because that runs the gamut of my own experience. And I'd like to start by talking about Abilene paradox in bedrooms, an event that occurred to me while I was a young assistant professor at the University of Texas. Prior to the actual trip to Abilene, I didn't know what it was at the time. I've seen it happen many times since then, but never quite so dramatically. And that is, I was sitting in my office in Mays Hall, and a young girl comes in that knew rather well. Her name was Sue, and looked kind of depressed. And I say, "What's the matter, Sue? You look a little depressed." She says, "I am." And I say, "Why?" And she says, "You'd be depressed if you had to get married Saturday night." And I said, "What's the problem with that? I'm marrying a boy I don't love, don't like, can't stand." "Well, why are you marrying him? He gave me an engagement ring." "Well, if you don't love him, don't like him, can't stand him, give the ring back." "I can't." "Why not?" "Mama loves him, she's got a heart condition, I give the ring back now, she'd drop dead of a heart attack, we have a room full of presents, the bridesmaids have their dresses done, relatives are already on the road from Oklahoma, Austin's a small town, I'd be the laughing stock, besides that I'm not very pretty, I might not get another chance, and he's basically a decent guy, I just don't like him. Maybe things will work out." And she leaves looking very depressed. 2 hours later, her fiance comes into the room looking very depressed. You say, "What's the matter, George? You look a little depressed." "Well, you'd be depressed too if you had to get married Saturday night." "Well, what's the problem with that?" "I'm marrying a girl I don't love, don't like." "Well, how did that happen?" "You got me. Moment of passion, a drive-in movie, one thing led to another, and I gave her an engagement ring." "Well, if you don't love her and don't like her, take the ring back." "I can't." "Why not?" "Daddy loves her, we got relatives on the road from Oklahoma, Austin's a small town, I'd be the laughing stock, church is reserved, got invitations sent out to 200 people. Besides that, she's basically a decent woman. It'd break her heart if I backed out now. Maybe things will work out." And he leaves looking very depressed. So here you find two people that don't love one another, don't even like one another, and are getting married in opposition to the agreement they share. And Saturday night rolls around, the preacher says the magic words, and metaphorically at least, they get in the car and leave for a honeymoon at the Good Luck Motel. Anyone in here been to the Good Luck Motel? With a laugh like that, would you like to tell them what it looks like? Or no? It's out on Route 84. It's got a neon sign with 2 letters missing. It says vacancy, flashes on and off, full every Saturday night from 9 to 12. Abilene Christian College primarily. And then you can get reservations at your convenience at other times. And as someone said, paradoxes make strange bedfellows. A terrible pun, but absolutely true. If you followed the marriage as I did, when it inevitably went sour, They had a baby they agreed neither wanted. In order to save the marriage they agreed both wanted out of. And then when they went through the divorce, and if any of y'all have ever been through a divorce or know those that have, you know how acrimonious and bitter those things can be. People that knew them well said about them, my God, they can't deal with their conflicts. And I would say, my God, they can't cope with their agreements. Try another one. I do a fair amount of consulting in addition to work like this. Several years ago I did some consulting with a research and development company in the oil business, and they were going bankrupt. It is not big by the standards of Xerox or IBM, but it was big enough in the community of which they were a part, and they were on the verge of bankruptcy, and I was asked to consult with them about why. I remember a meeting with the president of the company in his office, and I said, what is the problem? He said, we're going bankrupt. And I said, why? And his reply was kind of classic, and it was, that's what we're hiring you for, dumbbell. But we got through that one. And I said, surely you got some notion about why you're going bankrupt. Yeah, I know why we're going bankrupt. We're spending $3 million a year on a research project that has no possibility of succeeding. There's literally no way you can take peanut oil, turn it into jet fuel, and do it economically. Now, it wasn't quite that, but it was nearly that. One of those wild ideas that looked great on paper. Everybody is very excited about it from the first time I read the printout, so I knew it never worked. Our controller tells us if we invest any more money in that, we're going to not even meet the payroll 6 months from today. Well, if you know that, why don't you stop it? Man, you must be crazy. I've just been made president of the company. The board of directors had a big spread in the Wall Street Journal about this thing. If I say it won't work, they'll say they picked the wrong guy for to be president. I've worked my whole lifetime to get here, and I'm not about to blow the opportunity now. And besides that, I got a vice president of research that has staked his managerial reputation on getting this done successfully. He's got a bleeding ulcer. I'm not about to worry him over it. It's not worth killing a man about. Well, what do you do then? Oh, I go down and jolly him up every chance I get, saying, hang in there, victory or death, we know you can do it, don't give up the ship, your wish is my command, I've got absolute confidence in your ability. Isn't that what a president's for, is to keep a stiff upper lip during crises? Then you go talk to the vice president of research, and you say, the vice president of research, what's the major problem being vice president of research of this company? And being a good Texan, he says, shit, man, have you ever tried to turn peanut oil into jet fuel? And I say, no, I can't say that I have. What's the problem with that? No way you can turn peanut oil into jet fuel and make any money from it. It's one of the craziest ideas I've ever seen in 20 years in the business. It's going to bankrupt us. It's got me so worried my ulcer's bleeding. It's nearly killing me. Well, if you know that, why don't you stop it? Well, man, you try stopping it with the president of the company in your office every 3 days yelling, victory or death, we know you can do it, don't give up the ship, your wish is my command. I want that job. He's going to retire in 3 years, and if my ulcer doesn't kill me by then, I'm going to have it. And besides that, I got a research director who has staked his managerial reputation and his professional reputation on managing it successfully. Well, what do you do then? Oh, me and the president go jolly him up every chance we get and tell him to hang in there, victory or death. It's like following the Abilene Trail. You end up in a research director's office, and in small companies, they all look alike. They got metal desk and swivel chair and charts and graphs all around the room. Very depressed guy in horn-rimmed spectacles, a little more depressed looking than you, but not a lot. Sitting behind the desk, and you say, what's the major problem being research director of this company? And he says, man, do you know what they have me researching? And I say, I think I can guess, but you tell me. They got me trying to turn peanut oil into jet fuel. Isn't that absurd? What's absurd about it? No way you can turn peanut oil into jet fuel and make any money from it. It's crazy. I don't even go to meetings of the American Petroleum Institute anymore. They laugh me out when I go through the door. It's going to kill us. Well, if you know that, why don't you stop it? Man, I'm a middle-aged manager. I got 2 kids in college, alimony payments, no job market for anybody with my skills, and the president and vice president of the company in my office every 3 days yelling, victory or death, we know you can do it. Well, what do you do then? Oh, I write these ambiguous reports. They can take any damn way they please. But given their high commitment to the project, I kind of lean them to the positive side to help them out. You don't know where I can get another job, do you? So here are three people that agree that a project won't work. In fact, it's going to bankrupt them. And they meet as a 5-person research advisory committee in the boardroom of the company. And they all, again in a small company, look alike. They got teakwood panel walls, big oval-shaped chair, a table, leatherback chairs, founder's picture, and mutton chops appearing right down on the boardroom table. Comes up line item 32, peanut oil into jet fuel, $3 million. All in favor say aye. All hands go up. All opposed? Of course, there's no objection. The bus takes off for an off-site business conference at the Good Luck Motel. Living in Washington, I've been interested in how whole countries can go to Abilene. And this isn't going to be as clean as I'm going to describe it, but it's clean enough that it bothers me, and some of y'all may have been involved in it in a variety of ways. But I went back to 1946 and clipped headlines from the Washington Star, the Washington Post, and the New York Times relating to our involvement in Vietnam. And here's the way that reads. MacArthur says never get involved in a land war in Asia. Eisenhower says never commit troops to the continent of Asia. Kennedy says we must not get involved in the political and military activities of Southeast Asia. Johnson says we must withdraw from Southeast Asia. Ho Chi Minh says get out of Vietnam. UN votes U.S. get out of Vietnam. 79% of Americans polled in Lou Harris' poll says we must withdraw from Vietnam. Nixon runs on platform of withdrawing from Southeast Asia. General Westmoreland says Southeast Asia untenable from military point of view. Henry Kissinger says that it is imperative we negotiate a settlement to leave Southeast Asia, and the next headline is U.S. invades Cambodia. If you remember, that was Kent State. A number of people were killed on the campus of that university. Whatever your political orientation, I think you would agree that in editorials, in newscasts throughout the world, there was a statement, we are engaged in a great internal conflict and can't deal with it. And I would say, no, we were involved in a massive internal agreement and didn't know how to cope. Let me just try one other. Airport. This is one that I've just run across lately. Do y'all travel much in your jobs? Huh? Do you travel? Well, I've just run across this one lately. I do a number of seminars and things like this, and in addition to consulting out of town, where people come and work 3 days to a week or sometimes 2 weeks, and I've just found out about this trip. I've talked to both men and women about this one, and both men and women experience the trip. But I'm going to have to describe it from a man's point of view because I understand it better. And that is that after a man has been away to a program like this, away from his wife for a period of a week or two, and like, is this the last, are you okay? And it comes time, the last week and the last day of the program, Friday afternoon, before he gets on the plane and heads back home, he begins to have a number of fantasies about what's going to happen as soon as between him and his wife, as soon as he gets there. Hell, you're having them and the program isn't even over. Basically, the fantasies are as follows. That his wife will meet him at the airport at the end of the ramp of the airplane in her negligee, holding a bottle of champagne, will announce that Granny has called from Luray to take the kids from the weekend. She's reserved a hotel room at the Hyde House directly across the street from the airport, and they're going there immediately for a marvelous weekend together. The wife's fantasy on the way into the airport to pick up the husband is a little different, but on the same essential subject. And that is, the husband will come down the ramp from the airplane with a dozen long-stem roses purchased at the airplane's gift shop. Now, damned if I have ever found that gift shop, but it's got to be there somewhere. Will announce that Granny has called from Luray to take the kids for the weekend. He's made reservations at the best French restaurant in town for a romantic candlelight dinner together, and then has reservations at the Hyde House, where they're going to go for a marvelous weekend together. They meet at the end of the round, embrace, plant a gentle kiss on one another's lips, and he says, "How'd it go while I've been gone, sweetie?" And then, for reasons known only to the great Abilener in the sky, she says, "Well, you ought to have been here when the baby puked in the soup." And he says, "Well, it ain't been easy for me either." And suddenly they're getting involved in this hellacious argument, fight all the way home, and check into the Good Luck Motel in separate bedrooms. Incidentally, for $3 extra, I'll tell y'all what to do about that. That's each. One other thing, all trips to Abilene aren't a negative. I wrote an article called Abilene Paradox, and I wrote it really for people in business and organizations like this, but I found that it's had much more interest to families. And the last couple of years, my office has been inundated with couples who love one another deeply, who are deeply committed to maintaining their marriage, who respect one another immensely, and who are in the process of getting a divorce in opposition to the agreement they share. One of the great tragic trips to Abilene. Any question? Lord, it sounds like we ought to have a benediction rather than could this mystical process produce another slide? The Lord works slowly, but in strange and mysterious ways. Well, I've been interested in what causes this kind of insanity, because it is indeed insanity for people that love one another to get a divorce, for people that hate one another to get married, for companies that know how to make a profit to go bankrupt, for countries that want peace to go to war, and particularly for families that want to stay in Coleman playing dominoes to go to Abilene. So I've been trying to figure out what causes this kind of insanity, under the assumption that unless you know what causes it, in the same way if you don't know what causes a physical ailment, you can't do anything about it. And one of the things that I'm interested in, it is insanity. If an individual acts, for example, in a way that's self-destructive, we got a psychiatric term to describe that. Y'all know what it is? Anyone? He's crazy, but there's even a more specific word. If someone's self-destructive, harms himself. Suicidal or masochistic. And if a person is sufficiently suicidal or masochistic, we certify them as mentally ill and commit them to a mental hospital because they're self-destructive. If people in an organization are sufficiently suicidal and masochistic and self-destructive, we call it teamwork and promote them. And I've been interested in why in one setting the behavior that'll get you certified will get you promoted in another. And incidentally, I've written a great classic article about that y'all might like to read sometime. It's called Organizations as Frog Farms. And it deals with the way in which one of the basic purposes of many contemporary organizations is to turn good people into frogs. Frog, by the way, is spelled with a PH because frogs don't like to be known as frogs and try to hide their frogginess in ways that's transparent to others. It's got a section on the lonely life on the lily pad, one on the language of ribbit, one on how bullfrogs get to be president, one on why cow frogs don't, one on how to kiss frogs, one on if you kiss frogs, you ought to know it's very difficult to tell which way they face in the fog. It's got one on frog farts, and that's spelled with a PH so as not to offend anybody. It's got one on what happens when a frog farts in the fog, and what happens is it blows holes in the fog and destroys the atmosphere of magic required to maintain the swamp. And then it concludes with an absolutely boffo section on the difference between swamp drainage and area reclamation. But one of the themes of that is that in many contemporary organizations, mental illness is a requirement for promotion. Incidentally, has anyone in here been promoted lately? anyway, I've been interested in what causes that kind of craziness, and here for me is the process. First is I call action anxiety. Action anxiety says in general, all people in this room, when confronted with a potential conflict, know a sensible action they would like to take and can state it. That we know a sensible action we would like to take and can state it. But when it comes time to actually taking it, we become so anxious we can't carry through with it. We chicken out, we withdraw, we give up. So the girl in the wedding knew she wanted to say what? No. In fact, she could carry out the whole tearful scene she wanted to have with her fiancé, but she couldn't carry through with it. The research director knew he wanted to say what? Yeah, it's not just can the project. He had an anatomical location they could place it. It was extraordinarily precise, colorful, and he wasn't even medically trained. But it was clear. I knew I wanted to say to my father-in-law, I don't want to go to Abilene, I'd rather, but I didn't. And all in this room know and in touch with reality of what's sensible, and frequently we can't carry through with it. I sometimes call it the Hamlet phenomenon. After Hamlet's soliloquy of procrastination, do y'all remember that? It goes something like, to be or not to be, that is the question, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or take arms against the sea of troubles and by opposing in them. Hamlet knew exactly what he wanted to do, he just couldn't get cracking. And as best I can tell, he was the original resident of the Good Luck Motel. I haven't gotten overwhelming acclaim for that idea from my colleagues in the English department, but then they're just wrong. And then I had to say, well, why is it that we can generally state something that's sensible and can't carry through with it? And I came up with the notion of action anxiety, negative fantasies. And I also got that from Hamlet's soliloquy. If you remember on down in Hamlet's soliloquy, as he's musing back and forth and procrastinating, he says, what is it that rather makes us bear those ills we have than fly to others we know not of? Translation of that is, Abilene may be bad, but have you ever been to Bangs? And it deals with negative fantasies. Negative fantasies are the fantasies of disaster that we conjure up about what will occur to us if we behave sensibly. They're the fantasies of disaster that we conjure up about what will occur to us if we behave sensibly. So the girl says, yeah, it makes sense to give the ring back, but if I did, what'll happen? Huh? Be laughed at. Mom will die of a heart attack, and the relatives on the road from Mississippi will be mad, and I'll never get married again. The whole thing, all of it pours out. The research director says, yeah, it makes sense to stop this project, but if I did, what'd happen? I'd lose my job, and I can't afford it. And the fantasies of disaster are so great. We had two great fantasies, cultural fantasies, that kept us in Vietnam. Anyone know what they were? The domino theory. And it went, yeah, it makes sense to withdraw, but if we do, communists will invade California, and do you want to fight hand-to-hand in Los Angeles? And it didn't know what I was asking. Then that was replaced by the loss of face theory. The sole purpose of negative fantasies fascinates me. If I can get you to believe they're true, I'm released from any responsibility from having to do anything about solving the problem. So your name is what? Adams. So if I go to as a subordinate to Adams and with a sensible sounding action and then a whole list of negative fantasies about why it won't work, what I'm saying to Adams is, may I have a bus ticket to Abilene? And if he pays any attention to my fantasies as anything other than symptomatic of my desire to be released from responsibility of solving the problem, he's saying not only can you have a bus ticket, I'll drive. I just love the way negative fantasies work. Here's one that I heard a while back. Have y'all ever heard the fantasy, this is a lousy place to work because you can't try anything new or innovative around here? Has anyone ever heard that one? It's one of the ones that we use at GW quite a bit. But I talked to a guy, and he was unhappy with his job, and I was asked to talk with him about it. Why? And I said, why don't you like working here? Ah, it's a lousy place to work. What's lousy about it? You can't try anything new or innovative around here. Why not? They'll get you. Who'll get you? The people that get you if you try anything new or innovative around here. Who are the people that get you if you try anything new or innovative around here? Damned if I know. They're sneaky. Well, have you ever tried anything new or innovative around here to just smoke them out? Not with them out there ready to get me if I do. Well, you listen to that, and that'll get you certified in most countries. But what it is, it's a poignant plea. Please, Jerry, believe me, they're out there, because if you don't, I may have to try something new and innovative, and I may not either be bright enough or competent enough to carry it out. Or it's kind of an exaggeration, but not a great one. When I talked to the research director, I said, why don't you tell the vice president this project won't work? Man, you must be out of your mind. I'm a middle-aged manager. I have 2 kids in college, alimony payments, no job market for anybody with my skills. I go in and say this thing won't work. You'll say you're fired. I'll be thrown in jail for missing my alimony payments. My kids will have to drop out of college. They have kids as their own. They won't be able to get employed. We'll all end up as migrant apple pickers down at Winchester, Virginia, driving a battered pickup truck towards Lexington. By the time we hit Lexington, we'll all be on cocaine. Do you want to see us in the drug facility as a family? And I go, God almighty, I didn't know what I was asking. The one that really got me, I've been interested in what the negative fantasy was that kept me from arguing with my father-in-law in the original trip. That's been the one that's worried me the most. And I finally got it straight. I had the belief that if I argued with him, that he'd just say, pack your duds, get down to the Greyhound bus station, take the first bus out of town. I don't want to see you anymore. You're an embarrassment to the family. Incidentally, that was no fantasy. That was reality. I know it was reality. Some of us can tell the difference. I know it was reality because literally until the day died, when I'd go down to the pool hall, he'd introduce me to all the deadbeats in their drop-seat overalls. He'd introduce me to him as a carpenter. And I don't know one end of a hammer from another. And then everybody wanted help building their barns. And I finally had enough of it, and I said, you know, what's this all about? I'm no carpenter, and why are you doing that? And his reply was, hell, boy, if they knew you made your living just talking, they'd think my daughter married down, and I'm not about to embarrass her in public. So I never took any chances with the old man. Then I had to say, well, where do the negative fantasies come from? And for me, they don't just come from a mill. There's real existential risk. That is, life has real risk. You give rings back, mamas die of heart attacks. Happens once every 30 million times, but it will be on the front page of the Washington Post. Subordinates go into superiors and say, in my best judgment, this thing isn't going to work, and they're told you're fired. You withdraw the troops, and the dominoes fall. It happens. There is real risk. The best statement of commonsensical statement of risk was by John Kennedy when the Russians put up the Berlin Wall. Some of y'all may have been involved in that. Do you remember they put up the wall and Kennedy called up the reserves? Do you remember that? And one day, men who were working in an office building the next day were driving tanks down at Fort Polk, Louisiana, heading for Germany. And Kennedy called a press conference a couple of days after that, and a reporter was in the press conference, and he was absolutely furious that he'd been called up, and he said, Mr. President, why was I called up and others not called up? Why do I have to lay my life on the line and others get home scot-free? Why do I have to place my career in jeopardy, and other people in this room are going to stay here in the comfort of their home and pursue life as it's always been? Why me, Mr. President? Give me an answer. Why me? And Kennedy says, damned if I know. You're unlucky, I guess. And what else could he say? Life has risks that are existential, that are unavoidable. We can't get away from them. another statement of that comes from a book called Seasons of a Man's Life. Have you all heard of that book by Daniel Levinson? It's one of the great books that's been written lately. Levinson studied 40 men. He didn't study women per se. He studied 10 executives, 10 hourly employees of a gun factory, 10 novelists, 10 biologists, but in studying the men and trying to understand their lives, he found that he could not understand what was going on in the men's life in the absence of understanding the women that were close to him. And when he finished his book, he learned more about women than men. He is now working on a book called Seasons of a Woman's Life, and he's finding that he's learning more about men than women. But what he found is that all men in this room between the ages of 17 and 22, 28 and 33, 36 and 38, 40 to 45, 60 to 65, and if you live long enough, 80 to 85, will go through a 1 to 3 year period of intense anxiety and depression, during which time they question their love life, their occupation, and their dream. It is unavoidable. Everyone in here will experience it. And what he's finding with women, if you drop those age ranges 2 years, the same thing happens with women. Since men and women marry, with the women being 1 to 3 years younger than the man, it means the fit hits the shan for both of them at the same time. It is not a product of an industrialized society. For every 45-year-old military officer staring into a Scotch saying there's got to be more to life than a balance sheet, there's a 45-year-old Aborigine Indian somewhere in Australia standing on one leg, peering into the horizon saying there's got to be more to life than chasing rabbits. Every period has its own problems. 28 to 33, your marriage is likely to fall apart. 36 to 38 is called a becoming one's own man or woman crisis, where all over the world, for reasons really unknown, men and women go into their bosses. And have y'all ever heard the Johnny Paycheck song called Take This Job and Shove It? They walk in and say, take this job and shove it, I ain't working here no more. And bosses say, what happened? What did I do? They didn't do anything. They just got to be 36 to 38. 40 to 45, everything falls apart. It's the least creative time of a man or a woman's life, and the probability is high of divorce, of quitting one's job, and of even questioning one's continued existence. That ends up with what Levinson calls either a de-illusionment, which is becoming more realistic and about one's limitations and strength, or disillusionment, where one becomes embittered. And at that point, we kind of take a path in the road that is very hard to reverse after that. Each period of time is an existential period. No one can avoid it. It's because we live, it's a part of us, and it's one of the issues of human existence. And then I had to say, what is the existential risk then that gets us to Abilene? At first I said it was the fear of the unknown. Y'all ever heard that? What we're afraid of is the unknown. The ultimate unknown being death. That's what I thought. And that fear of the unknown, ultimately the fear of death, gets reversed and passed back in odd ways to where it causes people that don't want to get married to get married, those that want to stay married to get divorced, companies that know how to make a profit to go bankrupt, countries that want peace to go to war. And I said in some way that that's the basis of it. Then it occurred to me, you can never be afraid of the unknown. In fact, the fear of the unknown is the ultimate negative fantasy. If you can just snooker somebody into believing you're afraid of the unknown, you got them in the bus with the door locked. So I say, why don't you do something about this problem? Your name is what? Robert? And I say to Robert, why don't you do something about this problem? He says, I'm afraid. And I say, what are you afraid of? And he says, the unknown. And I say, well, do something anyway. And he says, how can I do it if I don't know what it is? And the door slams on my hand. Incidentally, that thought that we can never be afraid of the unknown came to me in an odd way. I'm interested in thought processes just of themselves. And when I was writing this article, as you can tell, maybe, I don't know if you can see it, I've got a golf glove hand. I'm a golf fanatic. I'm not a very good golfer, but I love the game and I play it fanatically. And I used to go out and play golf and think about these things, trying to get them straight in my head. And I was out at Leesburg Golf and Country Club. Anyone played that course out by the Leesburg? You know what it is. I was out thinking about this, playing golf with my 3-year-old son, Scott. Incidentally, it's hell playing with a 3-year-old. He drags your clubs very slowly. Putts badly, steps across your line, frequently lied about his score, seldom paid off on his bets. But anyway, Scott and I were out at Leesburg Golf and Country Club, and I was thinking about the fear of the unknown and kind of feeling uncomfortable with it. And I think it's the 5th hole out there. It's an elevated green, dogleg left. I got a 6-iron shot into the green, and Scott's standing about where you are, maybe 10 feet closer. Watch him, and as I'm in the midst of a backswing, I hear something down in the grass. Look down, and there is a large snake coming towards us. Have y'all ever seen that? A big fat one with its head elevated, weaving through, tongue darting, and all I know is I started running. And I got back to about where the flag is over there and turned around to grab Scott, and he wasn't with me. In fact, he was trying to catch the snake. And he'd piled right in on top of it, and he was yelling, "I got him, Daddy, I got him, give me some help, give me some help," and slapping, and the head was rolling, and the belly was rolling, and he was yelling. And I was standing over there, and I just stood for an instant and watched it. And then I thought it'd be a nice symbolic gesture to tell Beth I'd tried to save him. So I came and I hit him with the back of my hand and just rolled him over backwards. It scared him a lot worse than the snake. And it turned out that he was interested in the unknown quality of the snake. He'd never seen one live before. I was repelled by its known quality. And then it occurred to me how many things in life are interesting because they're unknown. In our part of the country, we'll pay anything for a Texas-Oklahoma football ticket when they're ranked number 1 and number 2. No one wants to go to the game when there's a 35-point spread. The fun of a business venture is not knowing whether you can succeed. The fun of rolling the dice at Atlantic City or Puerto Rico is not knowing how they're going to roll. And then I had to say, what is it that everybody in this room shares that is known to all of us that gets us to Abilene? And I came up with the notion of fear of separation. Do y'all know what analytic depression is? Well, if you don't know what analytic depression is, I kind of feel like Vince Lombardi. Have you ever heard that famous story of Vince Lombardi when he coached the Packers and they had a lousy game and he stormed in the dressing room after the game and says, "By God, don't even undress when the stand's clear. We're going out to practice. We're going to start with the bedrock fundamentals of football and work up from there. I don't care if it takes us till 4 in the morning and the temperature gets 60 degrees below zero. We're going to stay out there on the field till we learn the game. We learn it right. We're going to start at the beginning and work up from there, and this, gentlemen, is where we begin." And in a Lombardi fury that only he could generate, he grabs a ball from the ball basket, holds it up, and says, "This, gentlemen, is a football." And there's a 45-second silence, and Max McGee says, "Will you go over that again, Coach?" Analytic depression is the football of the Abilene paradox. Analytic means separation-induced depression. It was originally discovered by a physician by the name of Spitz with infants in founding homes around the turn of the century. And it leads to what is called marasmus. Marasmus is a Greek word which means wasting away. And what he found with infants is that if you don't pick up an infant in the first year of its life, in these homes there were so many kids that although they had adequate medical care and adequate food, if you don't pick them up and cuddle them and stroke them, they will get what is called analytic depression, separation-induced depression, they will reassume the fetal position, refuse to eat, and of those that develop it, about 35% of them die. Of those that don't die, they remain scarred either mentally or physically the rest of their lives. It's very hard and nearly impossible to get them out of it once they fall into it. And even though an infant can't think in that way, the way we're used, they do become depressed if separated from others. Connection with others is a requirement for survival, and any act which threatens us with separation, and a guy named Bowlby has pointed out that it is instinctive. It is not something that we learn or can beat out of ourselves or can learn not to appreciate. It is an instinctive. Connection is a requirement for survival. In adults, it's called the Musselman's disease, and it was discovered in prison camps during World War II. It's later been replicated, the same things in Korea and Vietnam, where particularly in people who are separated from those that they love, either psychologically or physically, like a Dear John letter or something to that effect, will cause an adult male in reasonably good physical condition in prison camp environment to go back to one's bunk, reassume the fetal position, and refuse to eat and die in about the same proportions as young infants. Connection is a requirement for survival, and I'm interested in how little managers in any organizations know that. We were talking, the session today will be on cardiology this afternoon. It's a great book by a guy named Lynch, cardiologist at Johns Hopkins University, who's written a book called The Broken Heart, The Medical Consequences of Loneliness. And he points out that one of the major problems of heart disease is loneliness. Anyone in here about 40 years old and unmarried? Hello? Anyone in? You're 40 years old, about and unmarried. Anyone 40 years old and married? You're 40 years old and married. You're 40 years old and unmarried. Your chances of dying this year are approximately 2 to 1 his. Thought you'd like to know that. Also occurs to me that this session could be a trip to Abilene. With me driving. So if y'all get bored or uninterested, tell me or leave. I know several weeks ago a friend of mine y'all know where Airlie House is out here? It's a conference center. We're supposed to do some program with a company out there, and he got sick with a 24-hour flu in the middle of the night and called me in the middle of the night to fill in for him. I didn't want to go because I had a golf tournament the next day, but I went to suit him, got out there, and none of the people there wanted to be there either. They'd all been sent by their boss. And we got through the introductory story, and one guy says, "Shit, the bus is loaded, let's go home." And everybody got up and left, and we had a marvelous time, and it terrified the training director. There are 2 sets of symptoms for knowing when you're on the road. One is seen out by an outsider, so I can probably tell when you're on the road easier than you can. You can probably come sit in my faculty meetings and tell when we're rolling. But here's what an outsider sees when a trip is on the way. One is anger, frustration, pain, feelings of impotence, and sterility. Anytime I see those things in an organization, I say, uh-oh, the bus is loading. Impotence and sterility are sexual terms. They're meant to be that because that's the way it feels. And but I don't ever use the word conflict in any relevant way. If you go to your medical, for me, conflict is a word very similar to headache to a medical doctor. If you go to a medical doctor and say to the medical doctor, "I got a headache," all the medical doctor knows is you've got trouble. The trouble could be a brain tumor, a blow to the head, or hangover, or tension, or the flu. It can be any number of things. Likewise, if you come to me and say, "I got a conflict with my wife," all I know is you got trouble. And the trouble may be that you agree on something important. Or if you say, "I got conflict with my superior," I know you got trouble, but the trouble may be that you agree. The second thing is that individuals agree in private and unknown to one another regarding the problem and solution. So let's just say your name here. Jim has put together a plan to reorganize his unit or whatever, and these 4 people report to him. And I go to Jim and I say, what do you think about the plan that you just sent out? And Jim says, gee, I wish I'd have never sent it out. I must have been drunk the night I sent it out. Been under a lot of pressure. It'd be a real mistake to go through it again. I wish I could withdraw it. I go to Chuck and say, what do you think of Jim's plan? And Chuck says he must be on the sauce again. It's a wrong time, wrong effort, waste our energy. I wish we could get it withdrawn before it's too late. And Jeff says the same thing. It's a terrible plan. We don't need to reorganize again. It'll never work. Let's withdraw it. Then in public sessions, those same individuals actively mislead or less euphemistically lie to one another regarding their true feelings of beliefs. So Jim brings together his staff and says, what do you think about my plan to reorganize the division? Just curious as to what you believe, and your name is Jim. Good God. Jim over here says, well, what we must do is to take into account the pros and cons given the exigencies of the situation to ensure the best interest of all are met within the framework of the overall plan for the organization and the long-term goals. And Chuck here says, what the shit did he say? Well, someone else says, I think he's in favor of it. And Jim says, well, if he's in favor of it, he must have misinterpreted it. Others must be in favor of it. And suddenly they make a bass-backwards decision. That's a behavioral science term. It's very easy to discover. You just ask, how was that decision? And people say it's bass-backwards, it'll never work. And then when people begin to blame one another, rather than debate the subject, you may be sure that the bus is on the way. So when by blaming one another, it's when the research director, the vice president, and the president start blaming one another for the debacle rather than arguing what was the substance of the problem that got them in trouble to begin with. You know the bus is fully loaded. The major finding for me or symptom is anytime you hear someone saying one thing in public, another thing in private, you may be assured the bus is rolling. So anytime you sit in a meeting and hear people say one thing, and then you go home and the phone starts ringing off the wall with them telling you what they really meant to say or believe, you know you're on the way. On your handout, the 10 questions, characteristic and non-characteristic. The more items you have checked in the characteristic column, the more items you have checked down the left-hand column, the greater the probability that you're on a trip to Abilene. So if you got 3 items checked in the left-hand column, you're in the Buick. If you have 5 items, you're taking a rest stop at the pool hall at Bangs. 7 items. But if you don't believe that, ask for $500 as a manager sometimes to go to a conference on how to manage conflict. You tend to get it. Ask for $500 to go to a conference on how to cope with agreement, and what do you get? An invitation to see your shrink and for a leg up on your mental illness. But agreement is a problem in the following way. Once you're in agreement with others, then you have to share risk with them. That notion of agreement, being in agreement, came to me very vividly several years ago. I did some consulting with a group of young employees of a state government. And have y'all read the book by McGregor on Theory X and Theory Y? Do y'all know what that is? Most people know, but they'd read McGregor's book on Theory X and Theory Y, and they decided that they were all members of the personnel division of the state government, and they wanted to make state government Theory Y in its personnel policies. They went away to a motel and worked for 3 days on putting together a whole series of policies and approaches to completely changing the personnel system of the state government. At the end of 3 days, there were 9 of them in the meeting. I said, what are you going to do with your work? And they said, nothing. Why not? If the governor knew we were down here, he'd fire us. The state controller would not pay us. We'd be docked for being away from work. It'd be a political issue. The papers would get onto it. We would be crucified in the press. The Republicans would make it a big campaign issue. We're not going to do anything with it. Incidentally, what are all those? Negative fantasies. My statement was, well, why don't you call the governor and find out? And they said the governor would fire us on the spot. Then one guy said, well, look, I know his administrative assistant, I'll phone. And he phoned. Administrative assistant picked up the phone. You only heard one end of the conversation. And the conversation went as follows. I know y'all probably aren't interested in this, but we're down here doing a little exercise in changing the state government. And the administrative assistant says, what's it about? And the guy says, well, I know you don't have much time and probably won't be interested and won't even want to bother the governor, but here's what it's about. And the guy listens a minute and he says, can you hold while I go get the governor out of the meeting? I think you'd want to make this a campaign issue. What was the reaction of the group in the room? Huh? Terror, shit. You want to take over from here? Yeah, oh my God. The governor came, and then he was one of these stereotypical guys with a big booming voice. And was, what are y'all doing down well, Governor, we know you're not probably not interested in it, and we don't want to take up your time, and if you don't want to hear, just say and stop me at any time, because it's probably very... And the governor says, what is it? And they explain, and the governor says, where are you? And everybody goes, phew. And then the governor says, if you're only 100 miles from here, can you wait 2 hours? I'll be there. I want to talk with you. We're going to run on this issue. Then what was the reaction of the group? Holy shit. And no one would believe it if you wrote it. 2 of them resigned on the spot. One took a job as a Peace Corps volunteer in Africa. The other called Washington and took a job in HUD. And the issue was that once they were unable to maintain the fiction of phony conflict with their superior, then they have to share their enormous risk that he's taking. It is better to be in conflict than in agreement, because once you're in agreement, you have to share the risk. Leads to the notion there is real and phony conflict. By that I mean there is real conflict. People of goodwill and good judgment do disagree on important issues. So I love you, I don't love you. I want to get married, I want to get a divorce. This project will make money. No, it won't. Let's invade Vietnam, let's stay out. People of goodwill differ. But there is also phony conflict. Phony conflict is the blaming behavior which occurs after agreement has been mismanaged. It's the argument between the president, the vice president, and the research director as to who was at fault after the agreement has been mismanaged. Knowing the difference between real and phony conflict, to me, is as important as knowing whether a headache is caused by a brain tumor or a hangover. The treatment is somewhat different. Leads to the notion of collusion. It takes collusion to go on a trip to Abilene. In the language of organizations, it takes a real team effort. Everybody has to cooperate to make the trip. Collusion has a definition very similar to Winston Churchill's definition of appeasement. Y'all ever heard that definition? It's like a man being in a cage with a lion, feeding the lion in the hope, the vain hope, that the lion will eat him last. Being on a bus to Abilene is like passing bangs. Everybody else saying, I hope somebody says, let's turn this baby around. It requires everybody colluding to get past bang. All must cooperate to cross the city limits. It leads to the notion of responsibility and choice. Since agreement is a problem, since it involves, trips to Abilene involve agreement, phony conflict, and collusion, everybody's got an equal responsibility and an equal choice to try to do something about the problem. The power to break the paradox's influence comes not from one's position in the hierarchy, but from one's willingness to take the risk of doing something. So it may be someone saying, I don't want to get married, or someone saying, I do. Someone saying, I think this will make a profit. Someone saying, I don't. Someone saying, I want to invade Vietnam. Someone saying, I want to get out. Or someone saying, the emperor has no clothes. The statements are identical. Incidentally, the notion of responsibility and choice came to me very vividly several years ago. When I worked for for 10 years in a private organization. And then I got this idea and I quit and went into academics. I'd been away, I took a 50% cut in pay to go into academics. And had been away from universities for 10 years when I did it. I was terrified. And I joined the George Washington University faculty and didn't know a thing about university's academic life and didn't know whether I could make it on the outside. And the first week I was on the faculty, I was also trying to write this article at the time. We had what is called an off-site faculty team building session. Have y'all ever heard of team building? Yeah. Incidentally, well, I'm an expert in team destruction. There's not a big market for that. But I find that team building is frequently a trip to Abilene where people who don't want to work together, can't work together, and have no reason to work together are shipped off for a week to learn how to work together effectively with a high-priced consultant driving the bus. And incidentally, I hope y'all keep doing that because Christmas is coming up and we can use all the help we can get. But anyway, we had an off-site faculty team building session out at Kenwood Country Club. Do y'all know where that is out here in River Road? We have 18 members of our faculty. It was an all-day meeting. It was the first day that I was officially on the faculty. We went out to Kenwood, to the Pine Room in Kenwood. We have 18 members of the faculty. I knew one of them well. The other 16 I only knew as you meet casually in meeting. And here's the way the meeting starts. The chairman of the department said, well, the purpose of this meeting is to determine how we can collaborate more effectively together. Anybody got any ideas? And the guy raised his hand, says, yeah, I got an idea. Let's team teach. Team teaching would be a marvelous way to increase faculty collaboration. Would really build the kind of spirit we want. And here's the next 2 hours of conversation. Team teaching never worked. Ms. Rosenblatt couldn't get it in the catalog correctly. The dean wouldn't permit it. Students would be confused by it. Textbooks aren't written for it. Classrooms aren't designed for it. The budget would never tolerate it. The dean would go with rage. Students would see professors kill one another in arguments in front of them. What are all of those? Negative fantasies. They just pour out. Incidentally, that's 2 hours of academic discussion, too. Then we have what's called the bathroom break, where everybody goes to the bathroom with a person they really trust to find out how the meeting's really going. Except I don't have anybody to go with. And I'm ensconced in a stall out at Kenwood, and I hear this conversation right outside the stall between two guys, one of whom had suggested team teaching. And here's the way the conversation went. God almighty, George, why'd you suggest team teaching? They nearly took you up on it. Well, how the hell was I to know anyone was interested in team teaching? I'd have never brought it up if I'd have known anyone was interested in it. Well, don't bring up anything that we're interested in. Can you imagine us team teaching? No, I can't imagine us team teaching, but we got to talk about something. We can't just look at our navels all day. Well, if we talk about something, make sure we're not interested in it. And the guy, I don't want to be at this meeting, but we got to do something while we're here. Well, if we do it, let's don't do anything important. And I'm sitting there saying, God almighty, the bus is loading. Pain, frustration, irritation, public position one way, private position another, bass-backwards decision. They don't want to be at the meeting, and neither do I. People beginning to blame one another rather than debate substance. And I say, Harv, the bus is loading. Sagebrush is blowing under the door. Dust is forming on the facilities. It's a prototypical trip to Abilene. You're writing the definitive piece of work about this. Go out there and say something and clean this baby up. And then a little voice on my shoulder says, but you don't have tenure. You got 2 kids in private school, no consultant lined up. The dean's known as an SOB, and a lot of these other people don't look too friendly. Keep your mouth shut. And then we went out, and another hour of discussion went on. And then have you ever been in a meeting where you heard your voice talk and wondered who it was? I remember sitting there and suddenly hear my voice talking, and it went something like this. My new colleagues sounded kind of nice. And then the voice continued. I do not want to be at this meeting. I don't want to collaborate with any of you. I remember the little voice on my shoulder saying, maybe you can get a dime, get American Security and Trust on the phone, get enough equity out of the house to get a pickup truck down to Winchester before the apple pickers start for Lexington. I don't want to collaborate with any of you. I don't even want to stay at this meeting. I will stay if the rest of you want to stay, but it's very important that I know your preferences. Now, I've estimated the silence at anywhere between an hour and 45 minutes. I got a tape recording of that meeting at home, and it shows 3 seconds. The tape stuck or something. And then Eric Winslow, who is now my closest friend on the faculty, looked up and said, "Son of a bitch, you too?" And in one of the strangest paradoxes we've ever had, we made an immediate decision to break up the meeting, never meet again on that topic, and went to the bar and drank collaboratively until people picked us up at 5 o'clock. It led me to understand that when Abilene operates, no, it doesn't take a great amount of time to produce major organization change. It just takes a willingness to be responsible for what one does, to make the choice, and to live with the consequences. Leads to another kind of notion, and that is the notion of confirmation and confrontation. You can play along with me. If you're going to have a confrontation with your spouse, it means what? Fight. An argument or a confrontation with boss means fight, disagreement, argument. I want to point out that we have defined confrontation to incorporate our negative fantasy about its outcome so as to prevent it from occurring. We've defined the word confrontation to incorporate our negative fantasy of its outcome as a fight so as to prevent it from occurring. And in that sense, we've even gotten Mr. Webster to be a map maker for a trip to Abilene. I define confrontation as a search for reality and truth. If you define it in that way rather than as a fight, you do something entirely different. You may find agreement or disagreement, or love or hate, or victory or death, or sickness or health, all with their own problems. But at least you do something differently. It leads me to the notion of confirmation. For me, confirmation is the most powerful form of confrontation. Confirmation is the process of affirming in another person what they already know to be true. It is the process of affirming in another person or organization what they already know to be true. To me, it's one of the most underused management and human skills that it's available to any of us. And for example, I'm interested that managers frequently manage under the assumption that they're supposed to tell people something they don't know. Again, with formal performance appraisal is predicated on the assumption somebody's going to tell you something about your performance you don't know about. Everyone in here already knows their performance. They don't need to be told it. It is all right, clear. Incidentally, around that, it's for that reason. I don't know if y'all do it here. Frequently, in sessions like this, people in the audience fill out reaction forms about my performance. I never read them. If I read them, it would be kissing the frog, knowing full well which way it faces. And incidentally, if you fill them out on anybody, you're kissing at the other end. But all of us, confirmation is one of the most powerful processes that's available, and it's one that very few people know about. I make kind of a sick living off people like you who don't know how, don't have anyone to confirm them. And who is the commanding general of the base here? Huh? Anybody know? Is this Fort Belvoir? Have I gotten in the right? Who's your boss?
My boss?
Yeah.
Fellow named Don DeVerja.
DeVerja? All right, here's a, I don't know Mr. DeVerja, but here's a frequent call I get. Incidentally, let's just use the general, the commanding general of this base. I don't know him, so I don't know a thing about him. But this is a prototypical call that I get from heads of organizations. And it goes something like this. Hello, I'm General Jones. I'm the commanding general of Fort Belvoir. We're going through a terrible time at the fort. with budget, with material, with men. I don't know what I'm doing. I feel out of control. I'm not providing leadership. I'm in over my depth. I feel like I'm not giving the kind of leadership and direction people at this post need. I feel absolutely incompetent. May I come talk with you? And I say, well, you've got hundreds of officers on that post. Why don't you talk to them? But let's just pick one. And here's someone in uniform. What is your name?
Jerry Harrison.
Jerry Harrison, and you're what? Colonel? Colonel, why don't you go to Colonel Harrison? But let's play it out. The general comes to Colonel Harrison, to Jerry back here, and says, Colonel, I'm not doing a good job. I'm absolutely incompetent. I'm not able to cope. I don't know what I'm doing. What do you think? And in general, what does Jerry say? Huh? In general, what does he say? Oh, no, you're doing a fine job. That's called frog kissing, knowing full well which way the frog is facing. Oh, no, you're doing a fine job. His negative fantasy, if he tells the general what he actually believes, that he agrees he's not doing the general will what? Fire him. So he says, no, you're doing a fine job. The general tells me Jerry lies under pressure. Incidentally, Jerry generally hits the phones as soon as the meeting's over and says, calls all his peers and says, by God, you're right, the old man is flipping out. Likewise, it is very unusual for Colonel Harrison to meet the commanding general on the post and confirm the general's competent performance. It is very unusual for a subordinate to go to a superior and say, General, just wanted to tell you what a great job you've done in running this post. Great piece of work. I've learned a lot from you by watching you. It's been a great honor to serve under you. I'm very excited that it's going to continue. I just want to say thanks. Our negative fantasy, if we tell our superior, confirm our superior's good performance, he will think we're what? Brown-nosing or frog-kissing. So we can't even tell him when he's done well. Likewise, it is very unusual for a superior to tell a subordinate unequivocally when they've done well, to confirm unequivocally a subordinate's good performance. So it's very unusual for Jerry back there to see his subordinate and to say, I just want to tell you, best job of running a company I've seen in the past 10 years, marvelous piece of work, great job, I love having you serve under me, I've learned a lot from watching you be my subordinate, thanks for being there, fabulous piece of work. It's very unusual for anyone to confirm unequivocally a subordinate's good piece of work. Rather, we go to him and say, Captain, I just want to tell you, you've done a good job running the company this year, and really quite outstanding in many ways, but don't forget in 1967 when you pissed in the grits. And incidentally, that's called balanced feedback, where never give a person an opportunity. And then if two people that work with one another for years, the subordinate wanting out and the superior wanting out, superior afraid to get rid of the subordinate for fear the subordinate will be devastated, the subordinate afraid to ask to be relieved from serving with a superior for fear that will be destroyed, and each live in what Sartre calls hell. Are any of y'all religiously inclined? Let's go again. Let's try it a little. How many go to church? Fair number go to church, and then an awful lot of sinners. The prototypical trip to Abilene or out of problems of confirmation to me occur in the church. And anyone in here a Southern Baptist? No? Brother. Too bad the others haven't been washed like we have. Well, I belong to the Southern Baptist Church. I love the church despite all its problems, and it's very important to me. But I'm interested in how often we go on trips to Abilene, and the prototypical trip around confirmation occurred one time when I did some consulting with a Southern Baptist church. It's one of the largest churches, inner city churches here in Washington. I got a call from the pastor, and it goes something like this. Jerry, I'm pastor of the ex-Baptist church. I fought the good fight, run the course, and kept the faith. That's 2 Timothy. That's a book from the Bible. that's a book religiously inclined people read from time to time. I fought the good fight, run the course, and kept the faith, but I no longer am capable of being pastor of this church. When I came here, I was a hellfire and damnation preacher. The church needs a social worker. When I came here, it was a white, affluent neighborhood. Now it's a poor, black neighborhood. I don't know the people, its problems. God in His infinite wisdom has been good to me to send me here. I know that He'll take care of me in the future, but this church needs new leadership, new blood, new direction. I want to resign. I want to resign Wednesday night at prayer service where you talk to people. And I say, yeah, I'll go talk to people. And I go to the chairman of the board of deacons, and your name is... I go to the you don't look enough like a deacon. Could someone that looks a little more pious try it? You're gray hair. You look you're what? John. That's better name. I say, John, what's the problem with the church? And he says, it's poor Pastor Jones. What's the matter with Jones? Bless his heart. He's fought the fight, run the course, and kept the faith, but he is no longer able to be pastor of this church. God's blessed us with him for 35 years, but it's time for him to leave. Well, I love him dearly, but he doesn't understand our people, our problem. I hope he resigns. I hope it's before it's too late. Then we go to the chairman of the Board of Education, and your name is Barbara. And I said, Barbara, what's the problem with the educational program of the church? He says, it's Pastor Jones. He's senile. What's the matter with... Bless his heart, he's fought the fight, run the course, and kept the faith, but he is not aware of the new educational programs of the church. I love him dearly, but I wish we could get someone new. Wednesday night rolls around, the preacher stands before the assembled congregation and says, dearly beloved, I fought the fight, run the course, and kept the faith, but I am no longer capable of being your pastor. I want to resign immediately. And what does everybody say? They may not be Baptists, but they could sing in the chorus. Their negative fantasy, if they confirm what they actually believe, he'll feel what? Hurt. So they say no, and then what does he say? Okay, I'll stay. I didn't know I was wanted. Translation of that is, let's open up the First Baptist Church at Red Creek in Abilene. And then 6 months later, they have what's called the bitter leadership fight in the church, where the church splits right down the middle between those that want the old pastor, those that want the new. People say, my God, what a conflict. I say, no, my God, what an agreement. Too bad that they couldn't confirm one another when the time was right. And then a last one that I've really been concerned about lately, probably to me the most powerful trip, deals with death and dying and people that are in the process of dying. If you've been around hospitals much, worked with Kubler-Ross or read her book, had relatives that are terminally ill, or friends, you'll find out that in general, when someone is seriously ill or terminally ill, there becomes a point in their life when they become aware that their time is limited and they don't have much more time. They generally, not all the time, but generally will pick out a close friend or relative and come up and say, John, I'm dying, I got cancer, I know no more treatment's going to work, my time's limited, I'm scared out of my wits, I want to talk with you. And what do we tend to tell them? You'll be all right, don't worry about it. I just read an article in Reader's Digest, and at the time a person needs to be in a position of non-marasmus the most, we load them on the bus and carry them to Abilene. If you want to see someone scared, see someone under those conditions. There was a great article in the Washington Post magazine section several weeks ago about kids over here in Children's Hospital with cancer. The kids inevitably, at some time, go to their parents and say, I'm very sick, I see other kids dying, is it likely that I'm going to die? I think I'm dying. And at that point, depending on what the parent says, if the parent denies that, the kid goes downhill faster than if they're willing to talk with them. And in fact, in some ways it may be as dangerous as the disease itself. Not quite, but maybe so. It leads to the notion of group tyranny and the Gunsmoke phenomenon. There is a belief in organizations that groups are tyrannical, that individuals exist in conflict with groups, and it's a requirement that individuals exist in conflict with groups. In fact, that one must give up their capacity to think, their integrity, any freedom to act because of group pressure, group tyranny. I just want to point out that for me, group tyranny does not exist Group tyranny is a culturally sanctioned scientific term. It is a culturally sanctioned negative fantasy designed by scientists to provide you with an excuse for being irresponsible if you can't think up one on your own. The tyranny of groups comes not from the reality of group tyranny for the most part, but from a belief in the negative fantasy of group tyranny. So if you can just snooker somebody into believing that you're afraid of group tyranny and mob rule, you've got them locked on the bus. How many of y'all got teenage kids? Fair number. Peer pressure. One of the great culturally sanctioned negative fantasies to release teenagers from responsibility for their own behavior. If your kid can just get you to believing that they ripped off the drugstore because of peer pressure, they've got you driving the bus on the way to jail. Group tyranny seldom occurs, but the tyranny of the myth of group tyranny is quite profound. And I've been interested in where we develop this myth, that there is a conflict between individuals and groups that makes groups tyrannical. I thought maybe it was from the reading the scientific literature. My doctoral dissertation was on group tyranny some 20 years ago. And I thought maybe people learned of group tyranny from reading dissertations and research. I later found out that's not true. Last year I went back to the University of Texas to the library to find out how many people had read that dissertation that I poured my life into for 3 years, and 2 have. Now I can understand why Mama wanted to read it, but the guy from Vanderbilt is a little beyond me, and I'd like to meet him some. So we don't learn about group tyranny from scientific work, and that individuals exist in conflict with groups from that kind of literature. And then I wondered where we got it, and for me we get it from what's called the Gunsmoke phenomenon. Do y'all watch Gunsmoke? Most of you have. This is the way you learn that there's a conflict between individuality and groups. And it's called the Gunsmoke phenomenon. How you train millions of people at the same time to believe. And here's how it goes. Every year there are 2 episodes of Gunsmoke. Go the same way. Some poor guy's riding across the prairie on his way to Dodge City to get provisions for his pregnant wife and 10 kids, and his heart falls into a gopher hole 8 miles out on the trail and goes lame. Simultaneously, the Frickert gang is holding up the Dodge City Bank, and in the process they murder the teller. Steal half the horses in town to thwart the posse. Ride out this trail where they meet the guy with a lame heart. Being greedy, they sell him a stolen horse. He naively rides it into Dodge City, where Dillon arrests him for horse theft, bank robbery, and murder, which, as you know, is not a misdemeanor. Dillon throws him in jail. The guy always contends he's innocent, and Dillon always tends to believe him. He says, yeah, I think you're innocent. I've heard you got a good reputation, but you're going to have a jury trial. Unfortunately, the judge ain't in town. Now, that judge is never in town. The judge is always at Pecos at a convention. He's going to be there in 5 days, and then they'll have the trial. And then he says, you'll have a trial in 5 days, and assuming you're innocent, and I believe you are, then we'll get Doc Adams out in time to deliver number 11. Then nighttime comes, and y'all tell me what happens. A lynch mob forms, but it forms in a particular location. The saloon. And what is the name of the saloon in that thing? Long Branch. There is a literate person in the room. And someone says what? Someone says what? Let's string him up. Ain't no need in waiting for no dumb circuit judge to get back from Pecos. We caught him dead to rights. Let's string him up. Get this town back on an even keel. Then everybody breaks for their ropes. Then they have what's called the torchlight parade up the center of town. Dillon is always looking out of the right-hand corner of the window. I've never understood that. And he always turns and says, oh, my God, Festus, we got another riot forming at the Long Branch. Get a shotgun, sit down by the cell. You get anybody that gets through the front door. I'll try to cool this baby off before it gets out of hand. And we say, my God, what group tyranny, what conflict. One man aligned against the irrational forces of a tyrannical mob, just like at the office. Can Dillon hold out? And then it's the third commercial, and then Dillon steps out. I'm always interested. There are 500 guys out there with pistols, whips, horses, battering rams, shotguns, torches, signs, bullets, ropes, and Dillon says, howdy. They say, howdy, Marshal, nice night, ain't it? That's called introductory palaver. Then someone says, Dillon, you know why we're here? Dillon always says, I know why you're here, and he taps that badge, and he says, but this here badge says there ain't going to be any hanging tonight. Get back to your cussing, drinking, women, you'll have your day in court. Then someone says, Dylan, we got no truck with you, but we're going to string him up. And Dylan always says, I got no truck with you either, but no one's coming in this here jail. Then someone says, we told you once, told you twice, ain't going to tell you a third time, we're coming in over around you, through you. And Dylan says, I told you once, told you twice, ain't going to tell you a third time, no one's coming in this here jail. And then someone says, step aside, Dylan, here we come. And we say, my God, what conflict, can he do it? And the crowd surges forward, and Dylan yells, hold it. See that line on the ground, fellas? And everybody looks down, and someone says, we see it, Marshal. And Dylan says, first person to step across that line gets his head blowed off. And inevitably someone says, well, if you put it that way. And the crowd disappears, and we say, my God, what a conflict manager. He managed the conflict with a tyrannical mob. He didn't manage a conflict. He coped with an agreement and helped them do what they wanted to do to begin with. But it is very important that we see him as a conflict manager, because if we don't, we got to take the same enormous risk he does. It's for that reason you can never question somebody's courage for being a conflict manager. And by that I mean being an agreement manager. It takes enormous courage to be an agreement manager, and by that I mean next week, new guy's riding across the prairie, get provisions for his wife. Hoss falls in the same gopher hole. Frickert gang strikes again, rides out, sells a new guy another stolen horse. He naively rides it in, Dylan arrests him, throws him in the slammer, the group comes up, the mob forms at the Long Branch, starts up the center of town. Dylan turns and says, oh my God, Festus, we have another agreement management situation festering at the Long Branch. You take the symbolic shotgun, sit down by the cell, I'll go out and make the ritual speech, cool this baby off, then you and me and Kitty will go have a beer. Howdy, Marshal, howdy, nice seeing you again. We're coming in, no you ain't, yes we are, no you ain't. We got no truck with you, I got no truck with you either. We're coming in over you, around you, through you. No one's coming in this here jail. We've told you once, told you twice. This is your last chance. I've told you once, told you twice. This is your last chance. And then someone says, step aside, Dylan, here we come. And the crowd surges forward, and Dylan yells, hold it. See that line on the ground, fellas? And everybody looks down, and someone says, we see it, Marshal. And Dylan says, first person to step, and he gets that far. And a bullet hole the size of a pie plate appears in his stomach. And as he crumples to his ground and Miss Kitty rushes to his side, he looks up and says, I misperceive the existential risk. If y'all will look on your third page, although I didn't ask you to fill it out, that's designed to assess the existential risk. And if in the slides, if you'll turn it to the slide on deciding, it'll help. See it. All this does, people are frequently frustrated on hearing about the Abilene paradox, because they want, I think it's within each of us to want a risk-free way to live, and a solution that's a perfect solution to a problem. I've never found a perfect solution to the Abilene paradox. All the last page is to help you do is to determine what the existential risk is of confronting whatever it is that you're dealing with. The first question of what action would you like to take assumes that everybody in here has action anxiety and can state a sensible action. The second question of what keeps you from taking it is to pick up your primary negative fantasy. In working with individuals, I have found that some individuals have produced up to 8 single-space typewritten pages of negative fantasies about what will occur to them if they behave sensibly. The next few questions of what will happen if you do what you want to do, you don't do what you want to do, and so forth. The key question is, what is the worst thing that can happen to you if you do what you think is sensible? And what is the probability of that? If you can't accept the probability of the worst thing that can happen to you if you do what you think is sensible, you got to get on the bus and ride. The question of what support do you need from others in order to carry out what you want to do says there is no such thing as the individual who works lonely independently. Everybody needs support from others in order to take a risk. So if a couple's thinking about a divorce, I encourage them to start dating other people so they can get on with it. If you're thinking about a job change, I encourage you to get another, or some issue that may get you fired, I encourage you to get another job in advance so you can have some support for going on with it. Those are designed to reduce analytic depression. No one can take a risky human action without something that protects them against analytic depression. And then what action do you plan to take? It's the last question. Just says any action you take is going to have a risk associated with it, including no action. Life isn't free. One of the great disservices we psychologists have provided you is to get you to believe that if only you have the right leadership style, know the right style of parenting, the right approach to conflict management, that life will be perfectible. All I would say is that, no, that's not true. Life has its existential risk, and you got to take them. That's what it's all about. If you know that in a Japanese organization, at least in the major ones, you cannot be terminated. You cannot be fired. Guaranteed employment reduces the risk of analytic depression. And incidentally, the same thing is going on in West Germany. Two disparate cultures attribute the enormous productivity and risk-taking in their organizations to a policy of guaranteed employment. The second is day work. Day work is an American innovation for reducing the risk of analytic depression. Day work says you work 4 days from one organization and 1 day for a non-competitive. It's an American organization. It's an American innovation. I got the idea initially from a maid that we used to have that worked for us, and I'd ask her to do something insane or crazy, and she said, I'm not going to do it. And I'd say, if you don't, I'll fire you. And she'd say, fine, I can always get day work. And I found I had no control over her whatsoever when I asked her to do something insane. That came of use to me, incidentally, several years later when I went to George Washington University. I went to the university, as I mentioned, with a 50% pay cut and no tenure. By the way, the failure to give somebody tenure is, or not giving a person tenure, is holding the threat of analytic depression over them so they can learn to kiss frogs like everybody else before they get promoted. And I went without tenure, and as some of you know, if you go to an academic institution without tenure, you have to meet with the promotion and tenure committee each April, and they tell you whether you've got a job the next September or not. And you don't know until then whether you're employed. And the first meeting I ever had at George Washington University reminded me of a day where official meeting was with the promotion and tenure committee of our faculty. And here's the first official words ever said to me at George Washington University. Professor Harvey, unless you quit thinking odd thoughts, making peculiar statements in faculty meetings, and writing bizarre articles, we're going to fire you. That's called management development. And I wrote them an article, which I later published, called I Can Always Get Day Work. The theme of it being that the fact that I can come here releases me from having to put up with the insanity at our school. And by the way, the fact that I have a full-time job there releases me from having to put up with your insanity too. The third is the right of appeal. That comes out of West Germany. West Germany, really means the right to go around one's boss if treated unfairly. It's a Western innovation. It's part of employment contract. And it is, in our thinking, is a violation of the chain of command. But if one feels that one is treated unfairly as a condition of your employment, you can go around your boss to anyone that you can get to listen, and it will not get you terminated or fired. It takes away the concept of management prerogative and have led to all sorts of requirements for changing the notion of chain of command. But it is coming, at least in industry. I have no idea about the military, and it's a basis for staying out of Abilene. The right to participate in all matters of policy. That comes from England, from organizations that are flourishing in England, and it's a response to their low productivity. All matters of policy means that it's the notion of the conflict in our country about union members on the board of directors of Chrysler or General Motors. In other organizations that are flourishing, all people have the right of employment to participate in formulation of policy in all issues. The last is grace. It's called Captain Osso and the Concept of. And this again just represents my interest in religion and another thing. Do y'all know what grace means in a religious term? Anybody? You want to tell it? That's right. It's unmerited forgiveness by God, undeserved forgiveness for our transgression. And in U.S. organizations, we don't give people grace. If you ever make a mistake, you're stuck with it for the rest of your life. I don't know if it's still true. Several years ago, there was a long article in the Washington Post about the military, that if a negative performance appraisal or efficiency report goes into your file, you nearly eliminate your possibility of becoming general. You never get forgiven for a mistake. And in the paper it pointed out that in organizations that do it, only mediocre people get promoted. Anyone that's any good has made a mistake. Amen, sister. But there are organizations that are working with the notion of forgiveness. For example, People's Drug Store has just instituted a policy. Every 3 years, all adverse personnel data in your file is taken out, so you get a new start, and you're given forgiveness and grace. Many organizations are doing it, so it doesn't mean that people are going to get kicked out if they make a mistake for trying something risky or new. But in our organizations, we don't have grace. In fact, we hang errors on people for a lifetime. Japanese organizations, by the way, have a notion of grace. They even have a ceremony of wa. Have y'all ever heard of that? W-A means harmony. And if a superior, or if anybody makes a mistake of sufficient magnitude, they can request the ceremony of wa and call for the ceremony. It means a meeting of superiors, peers, and subordinates. They apologize formally in a ceremony to all those that have been upset by their mistake. Then their apology is accepted. Everybody drinks to their health. Smash the glasses in the fireplace. All stuff is taken out of their personnel file. And then it's considered bad form ever to bring it up again in the person's career. Forgiveness is a part of the culture, under the assumption that people make mistakes. But anyway, I got interested in grace and Captain Asso. Do y'all know who Captain Asso is? If you don't know who it is, then let me tell you how I found out about it, and this is the way we'll end. I found out about it. My next-door neighbor is an Eastern Airline pilot. He flies Baltimore to San Juan. You remember that huge snowstorm we had here in the east several years ago that closed down the whole east coast? Well, during that snowstorm, he lives out in McLean, Virginia. It's 45 miles to the Baltimore International Airport. He didn't leave his house in time to make it to Baltimore to get to his plane. And when a pilot doesn't show up for his plane, that's considered poor form. And there were 96 people on board going to their summer vacation in Bermuda that were not overwhelmed with what he had done. And I said to him, my God, Al, isn't that a trouble for you? I said, boy, trouble is not the word. They can fire me, they can demote me, they can reduce me in seniority, they can discipline me, they can fine me, they can do whatever they want to. I said, what are you going to do? And he said, I'm going to invoke the Asso defense. And I said, what in God's name is the Asso defense? And here it is. Captain Asso was the Japan Airlines pilot who, November 22nd, 1968, landed the DC-8 stretch jet 2.5 miles out into San Francisco Bay in perfect compass line with the runway. He landed it so gently that most of the passengers didn't realize they were in the water. And in fact, one reported in a later interview he knew he was in the water only when a sailboat appeared outside his window. He landed it so gently that no one was hurt, no one was bruised, and in an incredible piece of luck, it came to rest on 2 oyster beds, the exact depth of the runway, the landing gear. It stood up in the bay. Had he gone 100 feet farther, the plane would have sunk. 100 feet less, it would, but it was just sitting out there with only minor structural damage to the strut. But anyway, the fact that Asso landed that plane out there irritated a large number of people. And it's a very funny kind. Since no one was hurt, I went up and read the accident report at the transportation headquarters here. It's this high. It has flight plans, physical exams of all crew members, interviews with all crew members, all window seat passengers, maintenance schedules, interviews with people sailing out in the bay, transcripts with the tower, all these compass headings and everything. It's this high. And you wonder what people say under great stress. The most interesting interview was with the co-pilot, and said to the co-pilot, "What did you say to Osso when you saw he was going to land it in the bay?" And his reply was, "I think you're a little low, Osso." But anyway, Osso put it down in the bay. It created a lot of flap. And in our culture, when someone does something like this, we do what? Find or look for a scapegoat. Who's at fault? The Japanese, in a very different way, assume that people will make mistakes and that grace is forthcoming. They had what is called the preliminary hearing out in San Francisco. It is a hearing to set the ground rules for the 6 months of bitter debate and fight that they assumed would follow to determine who was at fault, who could they hang for putting that plane down San Francisco Bay. Lawyers were renting suites of hotels to represent clients for the 6 months of fight. Ambassadors from all over the world were sending representatives. CBS, NBC were getting news crews in place for the 6 months of bitter conflict that was inevitably to follow as they looked for the scapegoat. Unfortunately, Osso thought as a Japanese, not as an American, and he was the first witness. And here's how the hearing went. It took place before 9 hearing examiners in a closed session, and Osso was the first witness, and the hearing examiner, the chief examiner, started the hearing as follows. Incidentally, Osso showed up in his dress whites, black shine shoes, crew aligned in order of seniority behind him, sat on the front row, and it was Captain Osso to the stand. And here's the way the testimony went. Captain Osso, in your own words, first question, Captain Osso, in your own words, can you tell us, how did you manage to land that DC-8 stretch jet 2.5 miles out into San Francisco Bay in perfect compass line with the runway? And Osso's reply was, as you Americans say, Osso, fuck up. And that's the end of the hearing. There is no more. All that had been said could be said. And there was nothing to add. It is the shortest hearing in FAA history, and all that was to be resolved were the details. Had Mr. Nixon known the Osso defense, he would have remained president. We have a tremendous need to forgive other people. Incidentally, I have to tell that as an apocryphal story. It was a closed hearing. It's known to airline pilots throughout the world. I went and interviewed 5 of the 9 hearing examiners that I could find that are still employed. The first, to see if he really said it, the first one said, yes, he really said it. Unfortunately, I was up to go to the bathroom, and by the time I came back, the hearing was over. I didn't hear him myself. I was just told. The others all deny that he said it, each saying there were grave international implications. And they go, and if we were to admit that, we'd all be in trouble, but it makes a marvelous story, doesn't it? I just recently, if you want to check it out, it's known throughout the world. I was flying back from Los Angeles the other day, and a guy that's a United pilot was sitting next to me. His home base is San Francisco. He flies San Francisco to Hawaii, and I found out what he did, and I just said casually, I'm doing some research. And have you ever heard of a guy by the name of Captain Osso, and he shouted, Osso, fuck up! And the whole plane turned inside out. So it's at your peril if you do it. But someday, rather than your efficiency reports eliminating you from being general officer, there will be an Osso defense. And in the military, you will have an opportunity to invoke the defense and then to achieve the status that you're risk-taking and desire to stay out of Abilene requires. Any questions? Well, if not, I'll be glad to talk with y'all later. If I had to summarize the idea in a sentence, I would not summarize it as a scientist because I'm not a scientist. I would summarize it in the words of the poet, the great lyric poet Grantland Rice, and if I would have to say what it means to me, it would be from his poem, when the one great score comes to right beside your name, It's not whether you won or lost that counts, but whether you're in Abilene.